In this segment, I'd like to talk about estimates, targets, and commitments. Understanding the distinction between these terms and using them carefully can go a long way toward helping improve estimation as well as the related activities of target setting and commitment. What do people mean when they use the word estimate? Well, I think people mean a lot of different things, and if you read the internet, you would read some really strange assertions about the definition of estimate, and so I think the first thing we should do is get our terms straight and take a look at what the dictionary says the word estimate means. If we go to dictionary.com, in the verb form, it says that the word estimated or estimating refers to forming an approximate judgment or opinion regarding the worth, amount, size, or weight. It also says to form an opinion of, to judge, and in the verb form used without an object, it refers to making an estimate. Emphasizing a few specific aspects of this definition, you can see the words approximate, approximately, or opinion, and I think it's significant. When we go to the noun form on dictionary.com, we see again the words an approximate judgment or calculation, a judgment or opinion, a statement of the approximate charge for work. So the key concepts from this definition clearly are approximate, opinion, judgment, and similar kinds of concepts. Going to a second source, Merriam-Webster says that estimate is to judge tentatively or approximately, to determine roughly the size, extent, or nature of, to produce a statement of the approximate cost of. So here too, the key concepts, kind of the same ballpark, approximate, rough, tentative, and so on. Third and final source, the Free Dictionary. The first definition includes the words tentative evaluation or rough calculation. A statement of the approximate cost of work to be done, a judgment based upon one's impressions and opinion. So when we put all three of these sources together, the key concepts really look like approximate, rough, tentative, impressions, opinion, and so on. So my question for you is, does this sound like what you're asked for when you're asked for an estimate? Are you asked for something that is approximate, rough, tentative, just for your impressions or your opinion? Or are you really being asked for something else? And I think that what we see in practice is people are often being asked for something else because people use the word estimate very loosely. And that brings us to our main topic, which is estimates, targets, and commitments. I think it's really important that we get very clear about the detailed, specific meanings of these words. Estimate really is what the dictionary says it is, of course, and to apply that in a software-specific context, I would say that what in software an estimate is an approximate analytical prediction of how long something will take, how much it will cost, or how many features can be delivered. Now, in contrast, a target is a statement of business need. That is a desirable business end state. How long we would like something to take, how much we would like it to cost, or how many features we would like to have delivered for a given cost and schedule. And third, a commitment is a promise to deliver functionality and quality by a certain date. These three concepts are all typically in operation at the same time in some form or other when we're talking about software estimates. And in an ideal world, the estimates, the targets, and the commitments would always be exactly aligned from day one of the project. But in the real world, realistically, these are nearly always out of alignment. We nearly always find that the business targets are optimistic relative to the estimates, or the estimates are disappointing compared to the targets, and this can affect the quality of the commitment process as well. And so we need to use the art of estimation to align estimates, targets, and commitments. When we don't use the art of estimation to align these terms, we get into some pretty common problems. And so I'd like to present a scenario that shows how these problems unfold when we use the same word, that is the word estimate, to refer to all of these concepts of estimates, targets, and commitments. And this really leads to some irrational and ultimately unhealthy organizational behaviors. So let's take a look at a scenario where we're looking at estimate negotiation. In this scenario, the boss comes in and says, I need you to come up with an estimate. And so the team goes off and the team works up an estimate, prepares the estimate. They present it to the boss, and how does the boss react? The boss says, your estimate is way too high. And then what does the team do? Well, the estimate is then negotiated, and the team proceeds to reduce its estimate, and then the project gets underway. And the project goes on for quite a while, and eventually the project is delivered at about the time that the team originally estimated, but late compared to the reduced estimate. And what happens then? Well, at that point, the boss says, this project is late and the team is a bunch of bad estimators. And all of this happens because we're using the one-word estimate to refer to the collection of activities of estimating, target setting, and committing. And when we call everything by the same name, then we run into a number of really unhealthy behaviors. Number one, we run into the unhealthy behavior of estimates getting negotiated. And that isn't really a rational activity for reasons I'll get into in a minute. Number two, ownership of the estimate is unclear. Who actually owns responsibility for coming up with the estimate when it's negotiated downward due to pressure from the boss? Well, that's not 100% clear. Responsibility for performing to the estimate is unclear. Is it really the team's responsibility to perform to an estimate that they no longer agree with? Well, if they kind of agreed with it or they didn't object strongly enough, maybe it does seem like their responsibility. And where's the responsibility for correcting a bad estimate? Well, if it's unclear whose responsibility it was in the first place, whose responsibility the error was, then it's not going to be very clear whose responsibility it is to actually make the correction. And in general, what we end up with is a lack of clarity and accountability, all arising from, in part, this just cloudiness around the use of the terms estimate and the lack of use of the terms target and commitment. So let's take a walk through scenario number one again, but this time really taking a look at the steps and seeing in detail where things went wrong. So step number one, management asks for an estimate. Actually, this very first step things can go pretty significantly wrong here because sometimes management's not really asking for an estimate. They're defining a target or asking for a commitment. And so if the team's not careful, they can actually misinterpret what management's asking for, and things can start to go south right on step number one. In this particular scenario, step number two, the team prepared an estimate. No real issues there, at least not this time around. Step number three, management says the estimate is too high. Well, how do we interpret management saying the estimate is too high? Usually what this means is the estimate is higher than expected. Management's not saying this estimate, in my judgment, is higher than is needed to perform this amount of technical work. Typically, management doesn't have a basis for knowing that. So when they say the estimate's too high, they're not critiquing the estimate as an analytical exercise. They're critiquing the estimate as its correspondence with the business target that they're trying to hit. And so usually I think what that means is when they say the estimate is too high is they're saying it's misaligned with the business targets. In step number four, the estimate is then negotiated, and this is a very problematic activity. It just doesn't make any sense analytically. If an estimate is an analytical prediction of something, it isn't appropriate to negotiate it. Negotiating it's not going to make the estimate more accurate. It's just going to degrade it or bias it in one direction or the other. So it really is not appropriate to negotiate an estimate or a prediction. It would be appropriate to review that for accuracy, but that is not typically what's done when we say that an estimate is negotiated. So the solution here is to clarify terms, and when doing that, to clarify responsibility and ownership for who owns what in the realm of estimates, targets, and commitments. And I think, properly speaking, estimates ought to be owned by the technical staff or technical leadership. If you think about it, technical staff and technical leadership really is in the best position to come up with the analytical assessment of how much work can be done for a given amount of staff time. They are the experts in software development capability and capacity, and so really it just makes sense that the estimates will be owned by the technical staff or technical leadership. Estimates should not be negotiated because negotiation just degrades the accuracy, and accuracy really is what we're looking for in estimates. However, of course, the team can clarify the assumptions in the estimates and clarify implications of estimates. That's all fine. Now, in order for the team to retain ownership of the estimates, I think the technical team has to be willing to give up ownership of the business targets. The business targets really are properly owned by the business staff. The business staff is within its rights to set business targets that are just wildly unachievable. The business staff doesn't necessarily know that they're wildly unachievable, but they can certainly be within their rights to define targets that would be very desirable combinations of cost, schedule, and functionality if it were possible to achieve them. And it is not proper for the technical staff to negotiate these targets any more than it's appropriate for the business staff to try to negotiate the estimates. But similar to the estimates, it is appropriate for the business staff to clarify the targets, clarify assumptions, and so on. Now, the third concept in play here is the concept of commitment, and commitments are owned jointly. They are owned jointly by the technical staff and the business staff, and it really is appropriate for these to be negotiated. And so let's go back to scenario number one and take a look at how that might look. If we go back to step number one, the boss says, I need you to come up with an estimate. That's the same. The team then prepares an estimate. That's also the same. The boss still says your estimate is way too high, and that's all the same. But now something different happens. Now the lead responds, we cannot change our estimate, but we will make whatever commitment is in the best interest of the business. And in my view, this is almost a magic phrase. We cannot change our estimate, but we will make whatever commitment is in the best interest of the business. And why is this okay? Well, I think it's okay first because the estimate is an analytical prediction. It doesn't make any sense to negotiate an analytical prediction, so my recommendation is don't negotiate them. Stand firm on your estimate as an estimate. Furthermore, I do think, though, it's important to recognize that all estimates are in some sense or other probability statements. Any true estimate is going to contain some notion of uncertainty or variability or probability, and as such, when we get to the point where we make the commitment does not bear any necessary relationship to the estimate. That is to say that the commitment can be conservative relative to the estimate, it can be on the high side of the estimation range, or it can be aggressive relative to the estimate. It can be on the low side of the estimation range. The commitment and the estimate are not in any necessary relationship to each other, and there's value in keeping them separate so that we can know whether the commitment that was made was conservative or aggressive relative to that estimation range. And that helps both keep the estimate clear, but it also helps to keep the commitment process clear, and it's good to have a clear understanding of both of those activities and processes. And I think it's, from my point of view, the level of risk in a commitment is properly a business decision. Businesses have a right to decide how much risk they want to take on in the software projects they conduct. It's within a business's rights to say, we think there's very little chance that this project will be successful, but we think there's a good business case for doing it anyway. I don't think that's a very common scenario, but I think that it's an allowable scenario, and it's within the business's right to take that kind of risk if they think they've got a good reason for it. More often, though, I think the business is not going to want to take on a high level of risk. In my experience, that is the exception rather than the rule. And so I think our scenario is actually going to turn out a little differently than just forcing the development team into the highest possible level of risk. So going back to our scenario, the team lead says, if it's in the best interest of the business to commit on the low end of our probability range, we can do that. Well, some technical people will worry that management will abuse that kind of an offer. But what I found is that management usually doesn't abuse that kind of an offer because now we have clear ownership of estimates, which the technical staff owns, and commitments, which are owned jointly. Management owns the commitment as much as the technical staff does, and this changes the nature of the commitment process a lot. So when the lead says, if it's in the best interest of the business to commit on the low end of our probability range, the management response I expect to see most often is actually something like this, where the manager says, I want a commitment that is achievable. That's really interesting. In my experience, this is actually the typical case. Management wants the teams to be able to perform to their commitments. And so what the team lead might respond is something like this: then we should commit on the high end of our estimation range. And I think you can expect, in response to that, the management to say something like this, where the manager says, well, if we do that, I want your assurance that you and your team will actually perform to that. At which point the team lead responds, no problem. No problem, really? Is that what the team lead responds? And that's actually right, because now that we have a commitment on the high end of our estimation range, we actually have a commitment that we have a good chance of achieving. And so if management was trying to get a high level of assurance that we could perform on the low end of the range, we'd have a hard time offering that. But offering a high level of assurance that we can perform on the high end of the range, well, that's something that we should be able to do. So this really creates a pretty striking contrast between the before picture in this scenario and the after picture. In the before picture, everything is called an estimate. The technical staff, quote, negotiates the estimates. the technical staff ends up owning both the estimate and performance against the estimate. And if there's a failure, including what's really properly a failure in the commitment process, implicitly this is all the technical staff's responsibility. Now, in contrast, in the after picture, everything has changed. The organization differentiates between estimates, targets, and commitments. And the technical staff now does not negotiate estimates, but they do express flexibility about commitments made relative to the estimates. And ultimately, the business owns the decision about how much risk to take on the software project. And this all makes it more likely that the project is going to be successful because it's put on a firmer planning foundation through a realistic estimate in the first place. But in the event that there's a gap between the estimate and the commitment, the estimate remains unchanged, which documents the nature of the commitment. That is to say, if we've got a documented estimation range going from A to B, and the commitment is all the way down at A, at the very low end of the range, or, God forbid, even below A, well, that's all documented because we didn't change the estimate. The commitment is now clear, or it's clear where the commitment is relative to that estimate. And if we do have a case where there's a failure, and I think that's less likely because we're probably going to make a better commitment in the first place, but if there is a failure, we can see whether that failure really is a failure in the commitment process, meaning we committed too aggressively, or whether it was a failure in the estimation process, meaning we thought we were committing at the conservative end of the range, but the conservative end of the range wasn't actually as conservative as it needed to be. And so we have a much clearer definition of what was the root cause of not performing to expectations. Was it bad estimation, or was it a bad commitment process? Now, I've used the word commitment a lot, and I think I should say a couple words about commitment in this after picture. I have met technical staff from time to time who really want to avoid making any commitments at all, and I think that's not very realistic. I think you cannot expect to get out of making commitments. You can expect you will be asked to make commitments probably on every project for the rest of your career or close to it. And the reason for this is that businesses live and die based on the commitments they make and the commitments they keep. And if technical staff refuses to play in that game, they essentially are refusing to support the business in the business commitments that need to be made and kept. And that is a recipe for not being seen as cooperative or collaborative with the business. So participating in the commitment process in a way that leads to achievable commitments, I think, is a much better strategy than refusing to participate in the commitment process. So I think you can expect to move toward making more achievable commitments. You can't expect to not make commitments, but you can expect to move toward making more achievable commitments in the first place. And the bottom line on this is that clarifying the terminology actually increases accountability on all sides. And this is certainly healthy for the software staff in that you get to commit to make commitments that you can actually achieve. But I think ultimately what it's really healthy for is it's healthy for the business overall, as there's just less turmoil around the software function, where the software function becomes more predictable and repeatable. The business builds its level of trust with the software staff because of that predictability and repeatability, and that ends up being healthy for the software team, but ultimately really ends up being healthy for the business overall.